My father left everything to his new wife. He forgot about the secret trust fund. The day my father died, I lost far more than a parent. I lost the man who had promised me my entire life that family always came first. At least, that's what I believed until his lawyer finished reading the will. Every house, every investment account, every share of his company, every antique my mother had collected before she passed away, everything went to his new wife. I received nothing, not even my mother's wedding ring. I looked around the conference room, waiting for someone to tell me there had been a mistake. No one did. My stepmother smiled without trying to hide it. She didn't cry. She didn't pretend to be embarrassed. She simply accepted congratulations from her attorney as though she had just won a business negotiation instead of inheriting an entire family. I left without saying a single word, because there wasn't anything left to say. Or so I thought. 3 days later, an elderly man I had never met knocked on my apartment door. He handed me an envelope that had been sealed for almost 20 years. Then he said something that changed everything. My father hadn't forgotten me. He had forgotten something else, something even his new wife never knew existed. A trust fund, one that could never be changed. My name is Charlotte. I'm 32 years old. For most of my childhood, my father was my hero. He built a successful manufacturing company from the ground up. He worked long hours, missed birthdays, canceled vacations. But whenever he came home, he always made me believe all of it was for our family. My mother believed him too. She stood beside him through every difficult year. When the company nearly failed, she mortgaged the house without telling anyone. When employees needed to be paid before Christmas, she quietly sold jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. She never complained. She simply believed that one day the sacrifices would be worth it. For a while, they were. The company grew. We moved into a larger home. Life became comfortable. Then everything changed. My mother became seriously ill. The treatments lasted nearly 2 years. Throughout that time, my father seemed distracted. Always traveling, always attending emergency meetings, always promising he'd spend more time with us once things settled down. They never did. My mother passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was 23. My father looked devastated, at least he did during the funeral. 6 months later, he introduced everyone to Diane, the woman who would eventually become his second wife. He insisted they had only met after my mother's death. I wanted to believe him. Most people did, but certain details never made sense. Diane already knew people in my father's office. She seemed unusually familiar with our family home. She knew exactly where dishes were kept in the kitchen. She even recognized neighbors she supposedly had never met before. Small things, easy to dismiss, until there were too many of them. Our relationship became polite but distant. She constantly reminded people that she wanted us to be a family. Yet somehow, every decision she made pushed me a little farther away. Family photographs slowly disappeared from the walls. My mother's artwork was replaced with expensive modern paintings. Her favorite furniture was donated. Even the garden my mother had spent years creating was redesigned because Diane preferred something cleaner. Whenever I visited, the house felt less like home and more like a hotel where I happened to know the owner. My father noticed. He always promised we'd talk about it. Later. There was always a later. Then the conversation stopped altogether. Eventually, I stopped visiting unless absolutely necessary. It hurt, but it hurt less than watching my mother's memory disappear one room at a time. 5 years passed. During those years, my father rarely mentioned the future. He never discussed inheritance, never talked about wills, never hinted at how he planned to divide everything. I assumed there would be time. There wasn't. One ordinary Thursday morning, his assistant called to tell me he had suffered a massive heart attack. By the time I reached the hospital, he was already gone. Less than 2 weeks later, I sat in a lawyer's office listening to the document that erased me from my own family's history. Or at least, that's what everyone in the room believed. The reading of the will lasted less than 15 minutes. It erased 23 years of being my father's only child. According to the document, Diane inherited everything. The family estate, the company, the investment portfolio, vacation properties, luxury cars, even my mother's personal belongings that had somehow become my father's legal property after her death. I was left with nothing, not a symbolic dollar, not a handwritten letter, not even one family photograph. The attorney explained that my father had updated the will 3 years earlier. Every page carried his signature. Every witness had followed the law. There were no obvious irregularities. From a legal standpoint, the matter appeared settled. As everyone prepared to leave, Diane finally looked at me. There was sympathy on her face, or at least something that looked like sympathy. She quietly explained that my father believed I had already built a successful career and no longer needed financial help. She, however, had spent years caring for him during his declining health. She suggested he simply wanted to make sure she would never struggle after he was gone. Several people in the room nodded. It sounded reasonable. almost generous, until I remembered something. My father had never been sick, not until the morning he died. He had remained active, still worked nearly every day, still traveled, still played golf twice a week. The explanation didn't fit the man I knew, but grief has a strange way of silencing questions. I drove home in complete silence. For the next 3 days, I ignored almost every phone call. Friends assumed I was mourning. In reality, I was trying to understand how an entire lifetime could disappear inside a single legal document. Then something unexpected happened. On the third afternoon, someone knocked on my apartment door. Standing outside was an elderly gentleman wearing a dark gray suit. He carried a worn leather briefcase that looked older than I was. His posture was straight despite his age. His expression was calm. He asked for me by my full name. When I confirmed who I was, he introduced himself as Arthur Bennett. The name meant nothing to me. He explained that he had worked with my grandfather for decades. Not my father, my grandfather. That immediately caught my attention. My grandfather had died when I was 9 years old. Very few people still spoke about him. Arthur reached into his briefcase and carefully removed a thick cream-colored envelope. The seal had yellowed with age. Across the front, my name had been written in elegant handwriting I instantly recognized. It belonged to my grandfather. Arthur explained that he had promised never to deliver the envelope unless 2 conditions were met. My grandfather had passed away, and my father had failed to honor a promise made many years earlier. Only then was Arthur allowed to find me. I stared at him in disbelief. The envelope had remained unopened for almost 20 years. Arthur refused to step inside until I broke the seal. Inside were only 3 items: a handwritten letter, an old black and white photograph, and a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The photograph showed my grandparents standing beside a much younger version of my father. Behind them stood a large stone building I had never seen before. The letter was much more interesting. My grandfather wrote that wealth had a dangerous habit of changing people. He feared that one day my father might forget why the family had built everything in the first place. If that happened, he wanted me to know the truth. Toward the bottom of the final page, one sentence had been underlined twice. Everything your father owns can be given away. Everything I protected for you cannot. I read the sentence 3 times, then looked up at Arthur. He simply nodded. Without saying much, he asked me to follow him. He said the brass key did not belong to a safety deposit box. It belonged to something far more valuable, something my grandfather had created long before my father ever became wealthy. And according to Arthur, not even my father's lawyers knew it still existed. Arthur drove without saying very much. We left the city behind within half an hour. The highway became a narrow country road. Eventually, we stopped in front of an old brick building that looked more like a private law office than a bank. There was no large sign, only a small brass plaque beside the entrance. The name engraved on it wasn't familiar. Arthur explained that the building had been operated by the same legal family for more than 70 years. My grandfather had trusted them with matters even my father never fully understood. Inside, everything felt frozen in time. Dark wood shelves, leather-bound ledgers, portraits of men and women who had practiced law for generations. No televisions, no reception desk filled with computers. It looked like a place where secrets were meant to stay secret. Arthur introduced me to another elderly attorney named Richard Collins. The moment he heard my name, he stood and shook my hand with surprising warmth. He explained that he had been expecting this meeting for nearly 2 decades, not because he knew when my father would die, because my grandfather had instructed him to wait until the appropriate conditions had been met. Richard unlocked a cabinet built into the wall. Instead of removing documents, he pulled out a heavy steel box. The small brass key from my envelope fit perfectly. When I turned it, the lock clicked open. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders. Everyone carried my grandfather's handwriting. There were financial statements, property records, investment certificates, letters, photographs, and one document sitting alone in the center. Its title immediately caught my attention: The Harrison Family Trust. The trust had been established 21 years earlier, years before my grandfather died, years before my father remarried, even years before my mother became ill. Richard carefully explained why. My grandfather had built his fortune during a period when several business partners lost everything because of inheritance disputes. He never wanted that to happen inside our family. Instead of leaving every asset directly to my father, he quietly transferred a significant portion into an irrevocable trust. The legal structure was simple. My father would control certain business operations during his lifetime, but ownership of the trust itself would eventually transfer to me, not through my father's will, not through probate, automatically. No future spouse, no rewritten will, no court challenge could change those instructions. I felt my heart racing. If that was true, Then why had no one mentioned it during the reading of the will? Richard answered before I even asked. Because my father's attorney had only handled assets legally owned by my father. The trust legally belonged to an entirely different entity. It never became part of his estate, which meant it never appeared inside his will. Arthur quietly slid another folder toward me. Inside was a complete inventory. My hands actually trembled as I turned the pages. The trust owned commercial office buildings, several warehouses, large investment accounts, shares in dozens of publicly traded companies, agricultural land in 3 different states, and something that shocked me most of all, 41% of my father's manufacturing company. I stopped reading. That couldn't be right. According to the will, Diane had inherited the entire company. Richard calmly explained the difference. My father had inherited management, not complete ownership. For years, everyone, including my father, had casually referred to the company as his. Legally, that had never been entirely true. The trust had always remained the largest single shareholder, and beginning that morning, I had become its beneficiary. I slowly looked up from the documents. For the first time since my father's funeral, I understood why my grandfather had underlined that sentence in his letter. Everything my father personally owned could be given away. But the one thing he never truly owned was already waiting for me. For several moments, I couldn't say a single word. I kept looking back and forth between the trust agreement and the ownership records. 41%, not 30, not 25. 41%. It wasn't just a valuable investment, it was enough to control the company. Richard quietly explained that my grandfather had designed it that way on purpose. He never wanted one person to have absolute power. He believed family businesses often failed when a single owner answered to no one. The trust had been created as a safeguard, not only to protect the family's wealth, but to protect the company itself. I finally asked the question that had been bothering me since opening the envelope. If this trust existed all along, why didn't my father ever tell me? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another folder. Inside were letters exchanged between my grandfather and my father more than 20 years earlier. My grandfather had made one request. When I turned 30, my father was supposed to tell me everything. He was supposed to introduce me to the trustees, explain how the trust worked, gradually prepare me to take over its responsibilities. There was even a signed acknowledgement confirming my father had accepted those instructions. Richard sighed quietly, but he never came back. The trustees had waited, 1 year, then another. Eventually, they stopped expecting the meeting. The trust documents were very clear. If my father failed to fulfill his responsibilities before his death, the trustees would contact me directly, exactly as they had done. Arthur handed me another file. This one contained minutes from trustee meetings stretching back nearly 2 decades. Every year, the trustees had reviewed the trust, protected the investments, approved business decisions, recorded one identical note at the end of every annual meeting. Beneficiary has not yet been informed. Reading those words made my chest tighten. All those years, an entire part of my family's history had existed without me knowing. Richard then turned to the company records. He explained that Diane had indeed inherited my father's personal shares. That amounted to 34%. Combined with several smaller shareholders loyal to my father, she probably believed she controlled the company. She didn't. The trust's 41% voting interest immediately transferred to me the moment my father died. Legally, I had become the largest shareholder 3 days earlier. No one at the company knew. Not the board, not the executives, certainly not Diane. Richard smiled for the first time, then slid one final envelope across the table. It contained a notice addressed to the company's board of directors. It informed them of the automatic transfer of voting rights. All it required was my signature. I stared at the paper. One signature. After everything that had happened, it almost felt ironic. Richard advised me not to delay. Corporate bylaws required the board to be notified immediately whenever ownership exceeding 10% changed hands. The longer we waited, the greater the chance someone else would make decisions without knowing the true ownership structure. I signed. Richard witnessed the signature. Arthur added his own as trustee. Within an hour, the notification had been delivered by courier to company headquarters. The following morning, something unexpected happened. My phone rang just after 8 o'clock. The caller ID displayed the name of my father's longtime chief financial officer. He sounded confused, almost nervous. He explained that the board had just received legal documents from the trustees. At first, everyone assumed they were routine estate paperwork. Then they read the ownership percentages. The emergency board meeting scheduled for that afternoon suddenly became something entirely different, because halfway through preparing to officially recognize Diane as the company's new controlling owner, the directors had discovered She never actually controlled the company at all. The emergency board meeting began at 2 o'clock that afternoon. I wasn't there. Not yet. Richard advised me to let the directors verify the documents before making an appearance. He said walking into the room too early would only create unnecessary arguments. Facts were always more persuasive than emotions. Meanwhile, the company's legal department was working frantically. The trust documents were authentic. The signatures matched. The corporate records matched. Even the state's business registry confirmed the trust had owned 41% of the company for more than 20 years. There was nothing to dispute. Inside the boardroom, confusion quickly turned into panic. The directors had gathered expecting to approve Diane as the new chairwoman. Instead, they were forced to reconsider everything. Several board members had never even heard of the Harrison Family Trust. Others vaguely remembered seeing the name years earlier, but assumed it was simply another investment entity. Only one person in the room knew exactly what it was: Harold Mason, the oldest director on the board. He had worked beside my grandfather before my father ever became CEO. When he saw the trust documents, he quietly leaned back in his chair. Then he admitted something that stunned everyone. He had signed the original corporate restructuring agreement 21 years earlier. He remembered my grandfather insisting that no future executive, not even his own son, should ever be able to control the company alone. The room became silent. Everything suddenly made sense. The ownership records, the voting percentages, the mysterious trust no one had discussed in decades. Diane sat at the opposite end of the table. At first, she remained remarkably calm. She insisted the documents had to be fake. She reminded everyone that my father had always introduced himself as the sole owner of the company. The company's attorney politely corrected her. He explained there was a significant legal difference between running a company and owning every share of it. My father had been the public face, the chief executive, but he had never possessed 100% ownership. Corporate records proved it. The attorney then asked a simple question. Had Diane received any documentation mentioning the trust during the estate process? She admitted she had not. Neither had her lawyer. Because legally, the trust had never belonged to my father's estate. It had nothing to do with his will. At that exact moment, I received another phone call. This time, it was Harold. Although we had never met, he introduced himself with surprising warmth. He apologized for contacting me before the meeting had officially concluded. Then he said the board unanimously requested my presence. Not next week, not tomorrow, immediately. An hour later, I walked through the front doors of the company for the first time in almost 6 years. Very little had changed. The marble lobby still displayed the bronze statue my grandfather had commissioned decades earlier. The photographs of past leadership still lined the walls. Only one thing felt different. Employees who had once recognized me as the founder's daughter now looked at me with curiosity. News of the emergency meeting had already spread throughout the building. Whispers followed me toward the executive floor. When the boardroom doors opened, every conversation stopped. 12 directors were seated around the long oak table. Diane remained in her chair. Her attorney sat beside her, surrounded by open folders. Harold stood and welcomed me into the room. Then, in front of everyone present, he acknowledged something no one had expected to hear that morning. According to the company's governing documents, I wasn't attending the meeting as a guest. I wasn't attending as the founder's daughter. I was attending as the company's largest shareholder. For the first time since my father's funeral, Diane's confidence disappeared. She slowly looked from the trust documents to the voting records, then finally toward me. She realized something the rest of the room had already accepted. She had inherited my father's wealth, but she had never inherited his power. The atmosphere inside the boardroom changed completely. Only an hour earlier, every chair had been arranged to welcome Diane as the company's new leader. Now, the agenda had been rewritten. The company's attorney carefully reviewed the trust documents one final time. Every director received a certified copy. Every signature had already been verified. Every corporate filing matched the state's records. There was no legal uncertainty left. The chairman finally announced that the board recognized the transfer of the trust's voting rights, effective immediately. I held the largest ownership stake in the company. No one applauded. The moment was too serious for celebration. Diane slowly pushed a folder across the table. It contained the transition plan she and her attorney had prepared before the meeting. She had already chosen new executives, approved management changes, even drafted a public announcement introducing herself as chairwoman. Every page instantly became useless. The chairman politely informed her that none of those decisions could be implemented without shareholder approval, and as the largest shareholder, that authority now belonged to me. For the first time, Diane lost her composure. She insisted my father would never have wanted this. She argued that she had been beside him every day during the final years of his life. She claimed she understood the company better than anyone. No one interrupted her. When she finished, Harold quietly opened one of the oldest corporate record books in the room. Inside was a handwritten letter from my grandfather addressed to every future board member. It had been placed there the day the trust was created. Harold read it aloud. My grandfather explained that businesses survive only when principles matter more than personalities. He warned that family relationships could change, marriages could change, even leadership could change. That was precisely why the trust existed, to ensure that temporary emotions never destroyed permanent responsibilities. When Harold finished reading, the room fell silent. Even Diane's attorney closed his notebook. There was nothing left to argue. The chairman then turned toward me. He explained that several important decisions could not wait: supplier contracts, executive appointments, a major expansion project. Without stable leadership, uncertainty would spread quickly throughout the company. I looked around the table. Most of these directors had worked beside my father for decades. Some had known me since I was a child. Others had never met me before that afternoon. I understood exactly what they were wondering. Could I actually lead the company? Before anyone asked the question, I answered it. I explained that I had no intention of walking into the chief executive's office simply because I owned the largest share. Ownership and leadership were different responsibilities. The company already had experienced executives. They deserved stability, not chaos. Several directors visibly relaxed. Instead of replacing management overnight, I proposed creating an independent review committee to evaluate every executive position based on performance rather than loyalty. No one would lose a job simply because ownership had changed. No one would receive special treatment because of family connections. The proposal passed unanimously. Even directors who had initially seemed skeptical voted in favor. Harold smiled. He later admitted it was exactly the decision my grandfather would have made. As the meeting continued, another issue surfaced. The chief financial officer quietly distributed a confidential report prepared only hours earlier. During the estate transition, Diane had already begun instructing company accountants to transfer several valuable corporate assets into entities she personally controlled. The transfers had not yet been completed. Fortunately, the emergency ownership review had frozen every transaction before the paperwork became final. The room immediately grew tense again. Several directors exchanged concerned looks. The attorney reviewed the documents carefully, then confirmed something alarming. If the board meeting had taken place just one day later, millions of dollars worth of company property would already have been transferred beyond the company's control. The chairman slowly closed the report, then looked directly at Diane. For the first time that afternoon, he asked a question no one else had dared to ask. He wanted to know who had advised her that those transfers were appropriate. Diane hesitated, only for a moment. Then she quietly mentioned the name of her personal financial advisor. The moment the name left her mouth, Harold's expression changed. He immediately recognized it, not as a respected advisor, but as someone who had previously been investigated for helping wealthy clients hide assets during inheritance disputes. No one spoke, because everyone in the room understood the same thing. What had started as a routine succession meeting was rapidly becoming something much bigger. The board meeting was suspended for 30 minutes, not because anyone needed a break, because the company's attorneys wanted to verify every transaction Diane had authorized since my father's death. When the meeting resumed, the preliminary report had doubled in size. It wasn't just the attempted asset transfers. There were consulting contracts, executive bonuses, property appraisals, several unusually large payments approved within 48 hours of the funeral. Every transaction pointed toward the same outside advisor, Richard Lawson, the financial consultant Diane had trusted for years. The company's outside counsel immediately recognized the pattern. Nothing had technically been stolen, not yet. Instead, everything had been structured to appear perfectly legal until the ownership transition was complete. Once the assets had been transferred into privately controlled companies, recovering them would have taken years of litigation. The chairman immediately ordered every transaction frozen. No exceptions, no further approvals, no executive signatures without unanimous board consent. Diane objected. She insisted every decision had been made to streamline the business. The explanation sounded reasonable, until the chief financial officer quietly produced another folder. Unlike the previous reports, this one contained emails, printed copies, time-stamped. The finance department had questioned several of Diane's instructions only days earlier. Instead of answering their concerns, her advisor instructed them to process everything before the estate becomes complicated. That single sentence changed the room. It suggested someone knew ownership questions were coming. The attorney asked where those emails had originated. The company's IT director had already traced them. Most had been sent from Diane's advisor's office, but one email had been sent from my father's personal laptop, 3 days after he died. Silence filled the room. That wasn't possible. The laptop had remained inside his home after the funeral. No one outside the family should have had access to it. The chairman immediately requested the device. Diane admitted it was still in my father's home office. She hadn't touched it. Or so she claimed. Within 2 hours, the company's digital forensics team arrived at the house. The laptop had indeed been powered on after my father's death. Several files had been opened, emails had been forwarded, financial documents had been copied onto an external storage device. More importantly, the security logs identified the exact time each action occurred. Those timestamps matched the period when Diane and her advisor were preparing the corporate transfers. The investigators weren't finished. The home contained security cameras my father had installed years earlier. Most people assumed they only monitored the exterior. They didn't. My father had quietly installed cameras inside his home office after confidential company documents once disappeared during a renovation. Almost no one knew they existed, not even Diane. The recordings were still stored automatically in cloud backup. The technician downloaded the footage. Everyone gathered around the conference room screen. The first few videos showed ordinary activity after the funeral. Relatives collecting photographs, employees returning company property, nothing unusual. Then another recording began, late at night, long after everyone had left. Diane entered the office carrying a small box. A few minutes later, Richard Lawson arrived through the back entrance. They sat together at my father's desk, opened the laptop, connected an external hard drive, spent nearly 2 hours reviewing confidential company files. Neither of them noticed the camera hidden inside a bookshelf. No audio existed, only video. But sometimes, video was more than enough. The room remained completely silent until the recording ended. One director slowly removed his glasses. Another simply stared at the screen. No one questioned what they had just watched. The company's attorney finally spoke. He explained that the footage alone didn't prove theft, but it completely destroyed Diane's earlier statement that she had never accessed the laptop after my father's death. She had lied. Inside a board meeting, while represented by counsel, her attorney quietly whispered something to her. For the first time that day, she looked genuinely frightened. Then something happened that none of us expected. The company's head of human resources entered the room, carrying another sealed envelope. She apologized for interrupting, but explained that several longtime employees had just requested private meetings with the board. They claimed they had remained silent for years out of loyalty to my father. Now, they believed the truth could no longer wait. One by one, they were prepared to explain exactly what had been happening inside the company long before my father ever passed away. The employee testimonies continued for nearly 4 hours. Each person walked into the boardroom separately. Each believed they would be telling a different story. Instead, every story fit together like pieces of the same puzzle. The purchasing manager admitted that, over the last 3 years, Diane had repeatedly pressured department heads to replace longtime suppliers with companies no one had heard of before. Those companies always charged more. Yet somehow, their invoices were always approved immediately. The accounting director revealed that many of those businesses shared the same mailing address, an address connected to Richard Lawson's consulting firm. The head of operations described how several experienced executives had quietly resigned after refusing to approve unusual contracts. At the time, everyone believed they were simply retiring. Now it became obvious. They had been pushed out. One retired vice president even submitted emails he had kept for years. In them, my father repeatedly apologized for decisions he admitted were not entirely his own. That sentence caught everyone's attention. Not entirely his own. Harold slowly closed the folder, then admitted something none of us had considered. Perhaps my father hadn't been controlling the company during his final years. Perhaps someone had been controlling him. The board immediately authorized an independent forensic audit covering every financial transaction from the previous 5 years. The investigation lasted almost 3 months. When the final report arrived, it filled 7 binders. The conclusion was devastating. Millions of dollars had quietly left the company through inflated consulting contracts, fake advisory fees, and shell corporations controlled by Richard Lawson and several associates. The fraud hadn't happened overnight. It had been carefully built over years. Every transfer was small enough to avoid attention. Together, they represented one of the largest internal financial schemes in the company's history. Federal investigators soon became involved. Search warrants were issued, bank accounts were frozen. Richard Lawson was arrested before he could board an international flight. His computer contained thousands of documents. Among them, drafts of estate planning strategies specifically designed to isolate wealthy spouses from their children. When questioned, Lawson agreed to cooperate. His testimony changed everything. According to him, Diane had not created the scheme. She had joined it. Years earlier, Lawson convinced her that if she gradually separated my father from longtime advisors, family members, and senior executives, she could eventually influence every important decision. My father had believed he was protecting his marriage. Instead, he had been surrounded by people protecting their own financial interests. Then came the revelation that no one expected. During the investigation, detectives discovered a locked storage unit rented under Richard Lawson's name. Inside were dozens of banker boxes filled with original documents. Among them was my father's personal journal. He had written in it almost every week during the last 18 months of his life. As I turned the pages, I realized the man I thought had abandoned me had been fighting a battle I never knew existed. He wrote that he no longer trusted several people around him. He suspected company money was disappearing. He admitted he wanted to repair our relationship before it was too late. Most heartbreaking of all, he revealed he had planned to rewrite his will. He had already scheduled a meeting with another attorney. The appointment was set for the Monday after he died. He never lived long enough to keep it. Reading those pages didn't erase the years of distance between us. It didn't excuse the mistakes he had made, but it answered the one question I had carried since the funeral. He hadn't stopped loving me. He had simply waited too long to fix what he knew was broken. A year later, the criminal cases finally ended. Richard Lawson received a lengthy federal prison sentence for fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and financial crimes. Several accomplices accepted plea agreements. Diane was convicted for her role in the fraudulent asset transfers and permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any corporation. Every dollar investigators recovered was returned to the company. The business survived, not because of me alone, because honest employees refused to let decades of hard work disappear. As for the Harrison Family Trust, I never treated it as a prize. My grandfather hadn't created it to make me rich. He created it to protect the family from exactly what had happened. His plan worked, not because it made me the wealthiest person in the room, because it ensured that integrity, not manipulation, would ultimately decide the company's future. Sometimes people ask whether I regret receiving the trust instead of the inheritance. I always give the same answer. The inheritance my father left behind almost destroyed a family. The trust my grandfather left behind saved one. In the end, my father believed he had left everything to his new wife. He forgot about the one thing that had never been his to give away. Thank you for listening to Reddit Stories. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more emotional Reddit stories filled with family betrayal, shocking twists, satisfying karma, and unforgettable endings. And let us know in the comments, if you discovered a secret trust fund that changed everything after losing your inheritance, what would you have done first?